The morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling military base as Sarah Martinez adjusted her nurse's uniform one final time before entering the medical facility. At 28, she had dedicated the last 6 years of her life to serving wounded soldiers, but today felt different. There was an electricity in the air, a tension she couldn't quite place her finger on. Sarah had always been drawn to helping others. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she watched her grandfather, a World War II veteran, struggle with injuries that never quite healed properly. His stories of battlefield medics who risked everything to save lives had planted a seed in her young mind. When she graduated nursing school, there was never any question about where she wanted to work. The Walter Reed Medical Center had become her second home. She knew every hallway, every room, and, most importantly, every patient who walked through those doors. The wounded warriors who arrived here weren't just medical cases to her, they were heroes who had sacrificed pieces of themselves for their country, and she was determined to help them reclaim their lives. Today, however, brought an unusual situation. The medical center was preparing to host a special ceremony honoring several distinguished service members. High-ranking officials were expected to attend, including some of the most respected generals in the military. Sarah had been assigned to assist with the medical needs of the honorees, many of whom were still recovering from their injuries. As she made her rounds that morning, Sarah noticed Marine Sergeant Davidson sitting alone in the rehabilitation wing. David had arrived 3 months ago after losing his right leg in an explosion overseas. What struck Sarah most about David wasn't his injury, it was his spirit. Despite everything he had endured, he maintained a sense of humor and determination that inspired everyone around him. "Good morning, David," Sarah said cheerfully as she approached his bedside. "How are you feeling today?" David looked up from the physical therapy equipment he had been studying. "Morning, Sarah. Feeling ready to tackle this ceremony today, though I'll admit I'm nervous about being in front of all those brass." Sarah smiled and checked his chart. "You've come so far since you arrived here. I remember when you could barely sit up for more than a few minutes, and look at you now, you're walking with that prosthetic like you were born with it." The transformation had been remarkable to witness. When David first arrived, he was angry, frustrated, and convinced his life as he knew it was over. Sarah had spent countless hours talking with him during his darkest moments, helping him see that his injury didn't define him, his character and determination did. "You know," David said, adjusting his position in the wheelchair, "I never thanked you properly for that night 3 weeks ago when I was ready to give up. You sat with me for hours, didn't you?" Sarah remembered that night vividly. David had received difficult news about his medical retirement from active duty, and the reality of his situation had finally hit him. She had found him in the common area at 2 in the morning, staring out the window with tears streaming down his face. Without hesitation, she had pulled up a chair and simply listened as he poured out his fears, his anger, and his grief for the life he felt he was losing. "That's what we're here for, David. You don't need to thank me for doing my job." "But it wasn't just your job, was it?" David asked, his voice soft but serious. "You could have called someone else, filed a report, and moved on. Instead, you stayed. You listened. You reminded me that I still had something to offer the world." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Nurse Patricia Williams, Sarah's supervisor and mentor. Patricia was a veteran herself, having served as a Navy nurse for 15 years before transitioning to civilian healthcare. She possessed a unique understanding of military culture that made her invaluable in this environment. "Sarah, I need to speak with you about today's ceremony arrangements," Patricia said, her expression indicating the importance of whatever she was about to discuss. Sarah followed Patricia to a quiet corner of the rehabilitation wing, noting the concerned look on her supervisor's face. "What's the situation?" Sarah asked. Patricia glanced around to ensure they weren't being overheard before responding. "We've received word that there might be some tension during today's ceremony. Apparently, there's been some controversy surrounding one of the honorees, Marine Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson." Sarah knew Thompson by reputation. He was a decorated combat veteran who had saved multiple lives during a particularly brutal engagement overseas. However, she also knew that his return home had been difficult. Like many veterans, he struggled with post-traumatic stress and had been involved in several incidents that had raised concerns about his stability.
What kind of tension are we talking about? Sarah asked.
There are some people who question whether Thompson deserves the recognition he's receiving. There have been allegations about his conduct during his final mission that some feel disqualify him from receiving honors. Sarah felt a knot forming in her stomach. Military politics were complicated, and she had learned over the years that there were often multiple sides to every story. What concerned her most was how this controversy might affect the other honorees and the ceremony's overall purpose.
How does this affect our responsibilities today? She asked.
We need to be extra vigilant about security and be prepared for potential disruptions.
The medical staff has been asked to stay close to the honorees and be ready to provide support if needed.
As they finished their conversation, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that today was going to test everyone involved in ways they hadn't anticipated. She returned to David's room to find him practicing with his prosthetic leg, determined to walk across the stage to receive his commendation without assistance.
You're really going to do it, aren't you? Sarah asked, watching him take careful but confident steps.
I have to, David replied, pausing to catch his breath. Not just for me, but for all the guys who didn't make it home. They can't walk across that stage, so I'm going to do it for them too. The emotion in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt her eyes begin to well up with tears. This was why she loved her job. Moments like these reminded her that healing was about so much more than treating physical injuries. It was about helping people rediscover their purpose and find new ways to serve.
As the morning progressed, more honorees and their families began arriving at the medical center.
The atmosphere was filled with a mixture of pride, excitement, and nervous energy.
Sarah moved between the patients, checking on their needs and offering reassurance where needed.
Among the families gathering, Sarah noticed a young woman in her early 20s sitting alone in the waiting area. She appeared anxious and kept checking her phone, as if expecting important news. Something about her solitary presence tugged at Sarah's heartstrings.
Excuse me, Sarah said, approaching the woman. Are you here for the ceremony today? Is there anything I can help you with?
The woman looked up with eyes that held a mixture of hope and worry.
I'm Jessica Thompson.
I'm here for my brother, Robert.
I traveled here from California because he doesn't have anyone else. Sarah immediately understood.
This was the sister of Staff Sergeant Thompson, the controversial honoree Patricia had mentioned earlier. The weight of the situation became even more apparent as Sarah realized this young woman was likely dealing with not only her brother's military struggles but also the public scrutiny surrounding his recognition. It's wonderful that you're here to support your brother, Sarah said, taking a seat next to Jessica. He's lucky to have family who cares enough to travel across the country.
Jessica's composure began to crack slightly. I'm worried about him.
He's been through so much, and now with all this controversy about whether he deserves this honor. I'm afraid it might push him over the edge.
Sarah could hear the genuine concern in Jessica's voice.
She had seen how public scrutiny could affect veterans who were already struggling with their mental health.
The added pressure of having their service questioned could be devastating.
Your brother served his country with honor, Sarah said carefully. Whatever controversy exists doesn't change the fact that he put his life on the line for others.
That takes courage that most people will never understand. As they talked, Sarah learned more about Robert Thompson's background.
He had enlisted right out of high school, partly to escape a difficult home situation and partly out of a genuine desire to serve. He had excelled in the military, earning multiple commendations for his bravery and leadership. However, his final mission had been complicated, involving split-second decisions in a chaotic combat situation that had later been second-guessed by people who weren't there. The hardest part, Jessica continued, is that Robert won't defend himself. He says the families of the men he couldn't save deserve better than excuses.
But I know my brother, he's a good man who did everything he could in an impossible situation.
Sarah's heart went out to both Jessica and her brother. The moral injury that many veterans carried, the weight of decisions made in life or death situations, could be just as debilitating as any physical wound. She had seen strong men and women broken by the guilt of surviving when others didn't, or by the consequences of actions they had taken to protect their fellow soldiers. The morning continued to unfold with a steady stream of activity as the ceremony approached. Sarah found herself thinking about the complex nature of heroism and sacrifice. In her years working with veterans, she had learned that the reality of war was far more complicated than what people saw in movies or read about in newspapers. The men and women who served faced impossible choices and carried burdens that civilians could hardly imagine. Around midday, Sarah was called to assist with the final preparations for the ceremony. The main auditorium had been transformed into a dignified venue with military precision. American flags adorned the stage, and chairs were arranged in perfect rows for the attendees. The atmosphere was both solemn and celebratory, reflecting the gravity of the occasion and the joy of recognizing extraordinary service. As Sarah helped ensure everything was ready, she noticed the 4 generals who would be presiding over the ceremony. They carried themselves with the bearing that came from decades of military service and leadership. These were men who had seen combat themselves and understood the true cost of the honors they would be bestowing. General Harrison, the senior officer present, was a legendary figure in military circles. He had commanded troops in multiple conflicts and was known for his unwavering support of the men and women under his command. His presence at the ceremony added significant weight to the proceedings. General Rodriguez, the second-ranking officer, was known for his work in veteran affairs and his advocacy for wounded warriors. He had been instrumental in improving healthcare and support services for injured service members. General Patterson, a decorated combat veteran himself, had earned respect through his leadership during some of the military's most challenging operations. His endorsement of the honorees carried particular significance given his own combat experience. General Wright, the youngest of the 4, represented the next generation of military leadership. He had risen through the ranks quickly due to his exceptional abilities and was seen as a bridge between traditional military values and modern approaches to warfare and veteran care. As Sarah observed these distinguished officers preparing for the ceremony, she couldn't help but think about the weight of responsibility they carried. These were the men who made decisions that affected thousands of lives, who balanced the demands of national security with the welfare of individual soldiers, and who bore the burden of sending young men and women into harm's way. The afternoon brought final preparations and rehearsals for the ceremony. Sarah watched as David practiced his walk across the stage, determined to complete the journey on his own despite the challenges posed by his prosthetic leg. His dedication was inspiring, and she could see how much this moment meant to him. Other honorees were going through their own preparations, some with visible nervousness and others with quiet confidence. Each had their own story, their own journey that had led them to this moment of recognition. Sarah felt privileged to be part of their healing process and to witness this celebration of their service. As the day progressed, word began to spread about potential protesters outside the medical center. Apparently, the controversy surrounding Staff Sergeant Thompson had attracted attention from various groups, both supportive and critical. Security was increased, but there was an underlying tension that everyone could feel. Sarah found herself thinking about Jessica Thompson, sitting alone in the waiting area, worried about her brother and the additional stress this controversy was placing on him. She made a mental note to check on her throughout the day and provide whatever support she could. The complexity of the situation weighed heavily on Sarah's mind. Here was a man who had served his country with distinction, who had saved lives and shown extraordinary courage under fire, yet he was being questioned and criticized for decisions made in the chaos of combat. It seemed fundamentally unfair, yet she understood that in a democratic society, even heroes were subject to scrutiny. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah continued her rounds, checking on patients and ensuring everything was ready for the evening ceremony. The medical center had taken on an almost electric atmosphere, with staff members moving with purpose and families gathering to support their loved ones. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. This ceremony represented more than just the recognition of individual achievements, it was a reminder of the sacrifices made by countless men and women in service to their country, and an acknowledgement of the ongoing challenges faced by veterans as they transitioned back to civilian life. Sarah thought about her grandfather and the stories he had told her about his own service. He had rarely talked about the battles he had fought or the friends he had lost, but he had often spoken about the importance of taking care of fellow veterans. He would have been proud to see her working here, helping to heal the invisible wounds that often proved more challenging than the physical ones. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow through the windows of the medical center, Sarah prepared for what promised to be an emotionally charged evening. The ceremony would soon begin, bringing together honorees, families, military leadership, and medical staff for a moment that would be remembered by everyone present. Little did Sarah know that the events of this evening would test her in ways she had never imagined, challenging her understanding of courage, justice, and the true meaning of honor. The story that was about to unfold would become one that she would carry with her for the rest of her career, a reminder of both the complexity of military service and the power of standing up for what is right. The stage was set, the participants were ready, and history was about to be made in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The ceremony began promptly at 7 o'clock, with the medical center's main auditorium filled to capacity. Sarah stood along the side wall with other medical staff, positioned strategically to provide assistance if any of the honorees needed medical attention during the proceedings. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and emotion as families, fellow veterans, and military officials gathered to witness this moment of recognition. General Harrison took the podium first, his voice carrying the authority and gravitas that came from decades of military leadership. He spoke about the nature of service, the sacrifices made by those in uniform, and the importance of recognizing exceptional courage and dedication. His words resonated throughout the auditorium, setting the tone for what was to come. "Tonight," General Harrison said, his voice steady and commanding, "we gather not just to honor individual acts of heroism, but to recognize the spirit that defines our military, the willingness to put others before oneself, to stand in the face of danger, and to never leave a fallen comrade behind." Sarah watched the faces of the honorees seated in the front row. Each showed a different response to the general's words, some with quiet pride, others with visible emotion, and a few with the thousand-yard stare that she had come to recognize in veterans who had seen too much. David Chen sat tall in his wheelchair, his prosthetic leg positioned carefully as he prepared for his moment on stage. His sister had flown in from Hawaii and sat beaming with pride in the second row. Sarah could see the determination in David's eyes. He was going to walk across that stage no matter what it took. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson sat near the end of the row, his posture rigid and his expression carefully controlled. Jessica sat directly behind him, her hands clasped tightly together, clearly nervous about how the evening would unfold. Sarah had checked on them both earlier and could sense the underlying tension that surrounded Thompson's recognition. As the ceremony progressed through the first few honorees, Sarah found herself deeply moved by the stories being shared. Each recipient had demonstrated extraordinary courage and selflessness in the face of danger. Their actions had saved lives, protected fellow service members, and upheld the highest traditions of military service. Corporal Maria Vasquez was recognized for her actions during a convoy attack where she had repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to provide medical aid to wounded soldiers. Despite being injured herself, she had refused evacuation until all her fellow soldiers were safely treated. Her story brought tears to many eyes in the audience. Staff Sergeant James Mitchell received recognition for his leadership during a complex urban warfare situation where his quick thinking and tactical expertise had saved an entire platoon from being overrun by enemy forces. His calm under pressure and innovative problem-solving had turned a potential disaster into a successful mission. Each story served as a reminder of the extraordinary circumstances these men and women had faced and the split-second decisions that had made the difference between life and death for their fellow soldiers. Sarah was struck by how young many of them were, barely out of their teens when they had displayed such remarkable courage. When David's name was called, Sarah held her breath. She watched as he transferred from his wheelchair to his prosthetic leg with practiced efficiency, then began his determined journey across the stage. Each step was deliberate and purposeful, and the entire auditorium seemed to hold its collective breath as he made his way toward the podium. General Rodriguez met David halfway across the stage, a gesture that wasn't part of the planned ceremony but felt absolutely right in the moment. The two men stood facing each other, the young Marine who had sacrificed so much for his country and the veteran general who understood the true cost of that sacrifice. Marine Sergeant David Chen, General Rodriguez began, his voice carrying clearly through the auditorium's sound system. Your actions during the defense of Forward Operating Base Charlie saved the lives of 14 fellow Marines and 2 Navy corpsmen. Despite suffering severe injuries yourself, you continued to provide suppressive fire and coordinate defensive positions until reinforcements arrived. Sarah watched as David stood at attention, his artificial legs steady beneath him, his face showing both pride and emotion as the details of his heroic actions were recounted. She remembered the angry, defeated young man who had arrived at the medical center months earlier, and marveled at the transformation that had taken place. The citation continued with specific details of David's actions during the attack. Enemy forces had breached the base's outer perimeter and were advancing toward the medical facility where wounded Marines were being treated. David had organized a defensive line with whatever personnel were available, including cooks, mechanics, and administrative staff who had never expected to be in combat. When an improvised explosive device had detonated near his position, destroying his right leg and severely injuring his left arm, David had continued to direct the defense from his position on the ground. He had used his radio to call in precise coordinates for artillery support while simultaneously providing covering fire with his sidearm. His actions had held the enemy at bay until reinforcements arrived, preventing what could have been a massacre of wounded and defenseless personnel. As General Rodriguez pinned the medal on David's uniform, Sarah could see tears streaming down the young Marine's face. But these weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of pride, accomplishment, and, perhaps most importantly, closure. This moment represented not just recognition of his past actions, but validation of his worth and his continued ability to serve as an example to others. The audience erupted in sustained applause as David saluted the general and began his journey back to his seat. Sarah noticed that he walked with even more confidence now, as if the ceremony had somehow strengthened his resolve and his sense of purpose. The ceremony continued with several more recipients, each story adding to the emotional weight of the evening. Sarah found herself thinking about the families of those who hadn't made it home, the ones whose heroism would only be remembered by their fellow service members, and the families who mourned their loss. These ceremonies were important not just for the living heroes, but as a way to honor all those who had served and sacrificed. As the evening progressed toward Staff Sergeant Thompson's recognition, Sarah could feel the tension in the auditorium increase. Word of the controversy surrounding his case had apparently spread, and she noticed several people in the audience who seemed more agitated than emotionally moved by the proceedings. Thompson himself appeared calm on the surface, but Sarah's trained eye caught the subtle signs of stress, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he kept adjusting his position in his chair, and the careful mask of control he maintained over his facial expressions. She had seen these same signs in many veterans dealing with post-traumatic stress, and her heart went out to him. Jessica Thompson looked increasingly nervous as her brother's moment approached. Sarah could see her checking her phone repeatedly and glancing toward the exits, as if she was considering whether to leave before things potentially got uncomfortable. The young woman's loyalty to her brother was evident, but so was her fear about what might happen. When General Patterson stepped forward to present Thompson's award, the auditorium grew unusually quiet. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, though for different reasons. Some were there to support a decorated veteran they believed deserved recognition, while others questioned whether his actions warranted such an honor. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson, General Patterson began, his voice firm and authoritative, distinguished himself through extraordinary heroism during combat operations in Operation Desert Shield. His actions directly resulted in the successful extraction of wounded personnel under intense enemy fire and hostile conditions. As the general continued reading the citation, Sarah learned details about Thompson's actions that put the controversy into perspective. During a complex mission to extract wounded soldiers from a compromised position, Thompson's unit had come under heavy fire from multiple directions. Several members of his team had been wounded, and the extraction was in danger of failing. Thompson had made the decision to break from the planned extraction route and lead his team through what appeared to be a safer path. However, intelligence later suggested that this route took them through an area where civilian casualties might have occurred. The controversy centered around whether Thompson had sufficient information to make that decision and whether alternatives existed that he should have considered. From Sarah's perspective, listening to the details of the situation, it seemed like an impossible decision made under extreme pressure. Thompson had been forced to choose between following a route that would almost certainly result in the deaths of wounded American soldiers and taking an alternative path that carried unknown risks. In the heat of combat, with lives hanging in the balance, he had chosen to prioritize the soldiers under his command. The citation detailed how Thompson had personally carried 2 wounded Marines to safety while under continuous enemy fire. He had made multiple trips back into the danger zone to retrieve equipment and intelligence that proved vital to subsequent operations. His actions had saved the lives of 6 American service members, though questions remained about the broader consequences of his tactical decisions. As General Patterson spoke, Sarah noticed movement near the back of the auditorium. A small group of protesters had somehow gained entry to the ceremony and were beginning to make their presence known. Security personnel were moving to address the situation, but the disruption was already affecting the atmosphere in the room. The protesters held signs questioning Thompson's heroism and demanding accountability for civilian casualties. Their presence was jarring in the context of what was supposed to be a solemn recognition ceremony, and Sarah could see the impact it was having on everyone present, especially Thompson himself. Despite the growing disruption, General Patterson continued with the presentation, his voice growing stronger and more emphatic as he detailed Thompson's heroic actions. It was clear that he was determined to ensure this decorated veteran received the recognition he deserved, regardless of the controversy swirling around him. As the general prepared to pin the medal on Thompson's uniform, the situation in the auditorium began to escalate. The protesters were becoming more vocal, and some audience members were beginning to respond with their own shouts of support for Thompson. Security was working to restore order, but the ceremony had clearly been disrupted. Thompson himself remained stoically at attention throughout the disturbance, but Sarah could see the toll it was taking on him. His jaw was clenched, his hands were shaking slightly, and there was a look in his eyes that she recognized from her work with veterans suffering from post-traumatic stress. He was fighting an internal battle to maintain control in a situation that was triggering memories of combat stress. It was at this moment that Sarah made a decision that would change everything. As a nurse, her primary responsibility was to the welfare of her patients and the people under her care. Thompson might not technically be her patient, but he was a veteran in distress, and every instinct she had told her that he needed support. Without thinking about the potential consequences, Sarah stepped away from her assigned position along the wall and moved toward the front of the auditorium. Her intention was simply to provide a reassuring presence for Thompson and perhaps signal to him that there were people in the room who supported him. However, as she moved through the crowd, one of the protesters apparently mistook her intervention for something else entirely. In the confusion and emotion of the moment, he reached out and pushed Sarah forcefully, sending her stumbling toward the stage area. The push was hard enough to knock her off balance, and she fell awkwardly, landing near the front of the auditorium in full view of everyone present. The immediate response was swift and decisive. Several military personnel moved to assist Sarah, but, more significantly, the 4 generals on stage reacted with visible anger at what they had witnessed. Here was a nurse who had dedicated her career to caring for wounded veterans being physically assaulted while trying to provide support during a ceremony honoring military heroes. General Harrison immediately called for order and for the immediate removal of the protesters. His voice carried the full authority of his rank and experience as he condemned the assault on Sarah and demanded that such behavior would not be tolerated at any military function. The other 3 generals moved to check on Sarah's condition, their faces showing both concern for her welfare and outrage at the disrespectful treatment she had received. These were men who understood the value of medical personnel and the sacrifices made by those who cared for wounded warriors. As Sarah was helped to her feet, she realized that her actions and the subsequent assault had fundamentally changed the dynamic of the ceremony. What had begun as a controversial recognition had become something much more significant, a moment that highlighted the importance of supporting those who serve, both in uniform and in the roles that support military personnel. Thompson's medal presentation continued, but now it took place in an atmosphere of unity rather than division. The assault on Sarah had apparently crystallized the feelings of many in attendance, reminding them that whatever controversies might exist about specific military actions, the men and women who served deserved respect and support. Sarah found herself at the center of attention in a way she had never intended or desired. Her simple act of trying to provide support for a veteran in distress had resulted in her becoming a symbol of the dedication and sacrifice of all those who support military personnel. The irony wasn't lost on her. In trying to help Thompson, she had inadvertently become part of the story herself. As the ceremony concluded and the auditorium began to empty, Sarah reflected on the complex events of the evening. She had witnessed heroism, controversy, division, and, ultimately, a moment of unity that had emerged from conflict. The evening had reminded her why she had chosen to dedicate her career to serving veterans, because they deserved not just medical care, but understanding, support, and recognition for the impossible situations they faced in service to their country. The push she had received would soon lead to consequences none of them could have anticipated, setting in motion events that would test everyone involved and, ultimately, lead to a moment of recognition that would change her life forever. The days following the ceremony were unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. What had begun as a routine evening at work had somehow transformed her into an unexpected symbol of dedication and service. The incident had been captured on video by multiple attendees, and, within hours, footage of the assault and her subsequent treatment by the generals had spread across social media and news networks. Sarah arrived at work the next morning to find her supervisor, Patricia, waiting with a serious expression and a stack of phone messages from reporters, veterans organizations, and military officials. The attention was overwhelming and completely outside her comfort zone. "Sarah, we need to talk," Patricia said, leading her to a private office away from the curious glances of other staff members. "This situation has grown beyond anything we anticipated. The hospital administration has been fielding calls all night, and, apparently, this has reached some very high levels of military command." Sarah sank into a chair, still processing everything that had happened. "I just wanted to help. I saw that Robert was struggling with the protests, and I thought my presence might provide some support. I never intended for any of this to happen." "I know that," Patricia replied, her voice gentle but serious. "But sometimes our actions have consequences we don't expect. What you did showed exactly the kind of character and dedication that we want in our medical staff. You put the welfare of a veteran ahead of your own safety and comfort." As they talked, Sarah learned about the broader reaction to the incident. Veterans organizations across the country had rallied to her support, praising her as an example of the civilian dedication to military personnel. Several major news networks had picked up the story, framing it as a powerful example of the bond between military service members and the medical professionals who care for them. More surprisingly, the incident had apparently shifted public opinion regarding Staff Sergeant Thompson's recognition. The focus had moved away from the controversy surrounding his tactical decisions and toward the broader question of how society treats its veterans. Many people who had been critical of his award were now questioning whether their opposition had been fair or appropriate. "There's something else," Patricia continued. "We've received word that the 4 generals want to meet with you this afternoon. They've requested a private meeting to discuss what happened and to personally thank you for your service to veterans." Sarah felt a mixture of honor and anxiety at the prospect. These were some of the most senior military officers in the country, and the idea of meeting with them privately was both thrilling and intimidating. The morning passed quickly as Sarah tried to focus on her regular duties while dealing with the constant interruptions from phone calls and messages. Several patients had heard about the incident and wanted to express their appreciation for what they saw as her standing up for veterans. Their support meant more to her than any media attention ever could. David Chen was among those who sought her out. He had been seated close enough to witness the entire incident and had been deeply moved by her actions. "Sarah," he said as she checked on his progress with his prosthetic leg, "what you did last night took real courage. You didn't hesitate to step up when you saw someone in trouble. That's the kind of person who should be taking care of veterans." "I just did what felt right in the moment," Sarah replied, uncomfortable with the praise but touched by his words. "Robert needed support, and I was in a position to provide it." "But that's exactly the point," David continued. "You saw a need and you acted, even though it wasn't your job or your responsibility. That's what separates people who truly care from people who just go through the motions." Throughout the morning, Sarah reflected on David's words and the broader implications of what had happened. She had never thought of herself as particularly heroic, she was simply a nurse doing her job to the best of her ability. But, perhaps that was exactly the point. Sometimes heroism wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic actions, it was about being willing to do the right thing when it mattered, regardless of personal cost. The meeting with the generals was scheduled for 2 o'clock in a conference room at the medical center. As the time approached, Sarah found herself growing increasingly nervous. She had interacted with military officers before in the course of her work, but never at this level of seniority, and never in circumstances like these. When she entered the conference room, all 4 generals rose to their feet, a gesture of respect that immediately put her at ease. General Harrison stepped forward to greet her personally. "Ms. Martinez, thank you for agreeing to meet with us," he said, extending his hand. "What happened last night was unacceptable, and we wanted to speak with you personally about the situation." General Rodriguez nodded in agreement. "We've all seen the video of what happened, and we want you to know that your actions embodied exactly the kind of selfless service that we try to instill in our own personnel." As they sat down around the conference table, Sarah felt the weight of the moment. These men had spent their careers making decisions that affected thousands of lives, and now they were taking time from their demanding schedules to meet with a single nurse about her actions during one difficult evening. "We understand that you've received a lot of attention since last night," General Patterson said. "That can't be easy for someone who was simply trying to do her job." "It's been overwhelming," Sarah admitted. "I never expected anything like this to happen. I just saw someone who was struggling and thought I might be able to help. And that's exactly why we wanted to speak with you," General Wright added. "In our experience, the people who make the biggest difference are often those who don't seek attention or recognition. They simply see what needs to be done and they do it." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. These 4 distinguished officers spoke with her as an equal, asking about her background, her motivation for working with veterans, and her thoughts on the challenges facing wounded warriors. They listened intently to her responses and shared their own perspectives on the importance of civilian support for military personnel. General Harrison explained that they had been discussing ways to better recognize the contributions of civilian personnel who support military families and veterans. Sarah's actions had highlighted the crucial role played by medical professionals, social workers, counselors, and others who dedicate their careers to helping veterans heal and reintegrate into civilian life. "We've seen too many examples of veterans who receive excellent medical treatment for their physical injuries but struggle to find adequate support for the emotional and psychological challenges they face," General Rodriguez said. "People like you, who understand that healing involves more than just treating wounds, are essential to helping our veterans rebuild their lives." As the conversation continued, Sarah learned more about the broader challenges facing the military healthcare system. Budget constraints, staffing shortages, and the increasing complexity of modern warfare injuries were all putting pressure on the system's ability to provide comprehensive care for wounded warriors. "What you did last night reminded us all that healing happens not just through medical procedures, but through human connection and compassion," General Patterson observed. "You saw a fellow human being in distress and responded with empathy and courage." Sarah found herself opening up to these officers in a way she hadn't expected. She shared stories about some of her patients, the challenges they faced, and the small victories that made her job so rewarding. She talked about David Chen's determination to walk across the stage, about veterans who had overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and about the families who struggled alongside their wounded loved ones. "One thing that strikes me about working with veterans," Sarah said, "is how often they apologize for needing help. They've been trained to be strong, to handle difficult situations, and to put others first. Sometimes the hardest part of their recovery is learning to accept care and support from others." General Wright nodded knowingly. "That's a challenge we see throughout military culture. We train our people to be self-reliant and to take care of their fellow service members, but we don't always do as good a job teaching them how to accept help when they need it themselves." The conversation shifted to discussing the incident with Staff Sergeant Thompson and the broader issues it had raised about how society views and treats veterans. Sarah shared her observations about Thompson's emotional state during the ceremony and her concerns about the impact of public scrutiny on veterans who were already struggling with trauma.
Robert Thompson made difficult decisions under extreme pressure, General Harrison said.
Were they perfect decisions? Probably not, but perfection isn't the standard we should apply to people operating in combat situations with incomplete information and lives hanging in the balance. The tragedy, General Rodriguez added, is that the controversy surrounding his recognition has overshadowed both his genuine heroism and the broader issues facing veterans. Your actions last night helped refocus attention on what really matters, supporting the men and women who have served our country. As the meeting progressed, Sarah began to understand that her actions had resonated with these senior officers on a deeper level. They had spent their careers making difficult decisions and bearing responsibility for the lives of those under their command. They understood the weight of leadership and the importance of having people around them who would stand up for what was right, even in difficult circumstances. We've been discussing among ourselves how to better recognize the contributions of civilian personnel who support our veterans, General Patterson said. Your actions have inspired us to think more broadly about the definition of service and the different ways people contribute to the welfare of our military community. Sarah was surprised to learn that the 4 generals had already begun planning a new recognition program specifically designed to honor civilian personnel who demonstrated exceptional dedication to supporting veterans and military families. Her actions had apparently provided the catalyst for an idea they had been discussing for some time.
We'd like to ask you to consider participating in the development of this program, General Wright said.
Your perspective as someone who works directly with wounded veterans would be invaluable in designing something meaningful and effective.
The request was both flattering and intimidating.
Sarah had never imagined that her work would lead to involvement in military policy or program development. But she also recognized the opportunity to potentially make a broader impact on the lives of veterans beyond her direct patient care. As the meeting continued, they discussed the practical challenges of implementing such a program.
How would recipients be identified? What criteria would be used to evaluate contributions?
How could they ensure that recognition reached people at all levels, from senior medical professionals to volunteers who provided simple acts of kindness? Sarah shared her observations about the various people she had worked with over the years who had made significant impacts on veterans' lives. She thought about the physical therapists who stayed late to work with struggling patients, the chaplains who provided spiritual guidance during dark moments, the social workers who helped navigate complex bureaucratic systems, and the volunteers who simply listened when veterans needed someone to talk to. The most important contributions often come from people who never seek recognition, Sarah observed. They're motivated by a genuine desire to help, not by any expectation of awards or attention. The generals nodded in understanding. They had all witnessed similar dedication throughout their careers and recognized the challenge of identifying and honoring people who preferred to work quietly behind the scenes.
As the meeting drew to a close, General Harrison made an announcement that completely surprised Sarah. Ms.
Martinez, we've discussed this among ourselves, and we want to present you with a special recognition for your actions last night and your ongoing dedication to our veterans. It's not a military award, but it's something we feel is appropriate to acknowledge your service.
Sarah was stunned.
She had never expected any recognition for what she considered simply doing her job. The idea that these distinguished officers felt her actions warranted formal acknowledgement was both humbling and overwhelming.
We'll be holding a small ceremony next week, General Rodriguez added.
Nothing as elaborate as last night's event, but something to properly recognize your contribution and to announce the new civilian recognition program that your actions inspired. As Sarah left the meeting, her mind was spinning with everything that had been discussed. What had begun as a simple act of compassion had somehow evolved into something much larger. She was being asked to help shape policy that could affect how the military recognized and supported civilian personnel who served veterans. The walk back to her regular duties gave her time to process everything that had happened. The phone calls, the media attention, the meeting with the generals, it all felt surreal. But underneath all the external recognition was a simpler truth: she had seen someone in need and responded with compassion, just as she did every day in her work with veterans. That evening, Sarah called her grandfather to tell him about the day's events. As she described the meeting with the generals and their plans for the recognition program, she could hear the pride in his voice. "You know," he said, when I told you all those stories about the medics and nurses who helped me and my buddies during the war, I hoped you might understand how important that kind of work really is. But I never imagined you'd end up sitting in a room with 4 generals talking about how to make things better for veterans." "I still can't quite believe it myself," Sarah replied. "It all happened so fast, and I'm not sure I'm the right person for this kind of responsibility." "You are exactly the right person," her grandfather said firmly. "You care about veterans not because of what they can do for you, but because of what you can do for them. That's the kind of person who should be making decisions about how to help people like me." As she ended the call, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. She was still the same nurse, still committed to caring for wounded veterans, but now she had an opportunity to impact their lives on a much broader scale. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also exciting to think about the potential to make a real difference in the system that served those who had served their country. The week ahead would bring new challenges and opportunities as she prepared for the recognition ceremony and began working with the generals on their new program. But tonight, she was content to know that she had stayed true to her values and that her actions had opened doors to help even more veterans in the future. The week leading up to the recognition ceremony passed in a blur of activity unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. The story of her actions and the subsequent meeting with the 4 generals had continued to spread, drawing attention from veterans organizations, healthcare professionals, and military families across the country. What had begun as a local incident had somehow become a national conversation about civilian support for veterans and the meaning of service beyond uniform. Sarah found herself struggling to balance her regular nursing duties with the constant requests for interviews, speaking engagements, and meetings related to the developing recognition program. Patricia had arranged for additional nursing coverage to help manage Sarah's patient load, but she was determined not to let the external attention interfere with her primary responsibility to the veterans under her care. David Chen had become one of her strongest supporters, often deflecting media requests and protecting her time so she could focus on her patients. His own recovery had progressed remarkably since the ceremony, and he had begun working with other amputee veterans, sharing his experience and providing encouragement during their darkest moments. "You know," David said during one of their regular check-ins, "watching you handle all this attention while still taking care of your patients has taught me something important about real leadership. It's not about seeking the spotlight, it's about staying focused on your mission even when the spotlight finds you." Sarah appreciated his support more than she could express. The media attention had been overwhelming at times, and having patients like David who understood her true priorities helped keep her grounded in what really mattered. Staff Sergeant Robert Thompson had also reached out to her during the week, requesting a private meeting to thank her for her support during the ceremony. When they met in a quiet corner of the medical center's cafe, Sarah was struck by how different he seemed from the tense, controlled man she had observed during the ceremony. "I wanted to thank you for what you did," Robert said, his voice carrying a sincerity that was unmistakable. "I know you didn't know me personally, but you saw someone in distress and responded without hesitation. That means more to me than any medal or recognition ever could." As they talked, Sarah learned more about Robert's background and the challenges he had faced since returning from deployment. Like many veterans, he struggled with survivor's guilt, questioning every decision he had made during combat and wondering if he could have done something different to save more lives. "The hardest part about the controversy," Robert admitted, "isn't the criticism of my tactical decisions. It's the fear that maybe they're right, maybe I don't deserve recognition when other people died because of choices I made." Sarah listened carefully before responding. "From what I've learned about your situation, you made the best decisions you could with the information you had available, under extreme pressure, with lives hanging in the balance. That's what we ask of our military leaders, not perfection, but dedication and courage in impossible circumstances." Their conversation helped Sarah understand the broader impact of the incident beyond her own experience. The attack on her had apparently crystallized public opinion around the question of how society treats its veterans. Many people who had been critical of Robert's recognition began to question whether their opposition was fair, and veterans organizations had rallied around the idea that all service members deserved respect and support, regardless of controversial tactical decisions. "What happened to you changed the conversation," Robert explained. "Instead of arguing about whether I deserved recognition, people started talking about whether we support our veterans properly and whether civilians who dedicate their lives to helping us deserve recognition too. As the week progressed, Sarah became increasingly involved in planning the recognition ceremony and developing the new civilian recognition program. The four generals had assigned a small team of military personnel to work with her on program design, criteria development, and implementation planning. The meetings were intensive and, sometimes overwhelming, but also incredibly rewarding as she saw her ideas taking shape into concrete policies that could help thousands of veterans. The new program, tentatively called the Civilian Service Recognition Initiative, would acknowledge individuals who demonstrated exceptional dedication to supporting veterans, military families, and active duty personnel. Categories would include healthcare professionals, educators, employers who supported veteran hiring, volunteers who provided various services, and others who made significant contributions to military communities. The goal, explained Colonel Martinez, the officer assigned to lead the program development, is to recognize that military service and civilian support are both essential components of our national defense. We can't function effectively without dedicated civilians who understand and support our mission. Sarah's input proved valuable in developing criteria that would identify genuine dedication rather than simply rewarding high-profile contributions. She advocated for recognition of people who worked quietly behind the scenes, who went beyond their basic job requirements, and who demonstrated long-term commitment to supporting veterans rather than one-time gestures. The people who make the biggest difference in veterans' lives are often those who never seek recognition, Sarah told the planning committee. They're motivated by genuine compassion and a desire to help, not by any expectation of awards or attention. As the recognition ceremony approached, Sarah learned that the event had grown far beyond what anyone had originally planned. Veterans organizations from across the country were sending representatives, military families were traveling significant distances to attend, and several members of Congress had requested invitations. The simple acknowledgement that the generals had envisioned had evolved into a major event. The night before the ceremony, Sarah had trouble sleeping. The weight of everything that had happened over the past week was finally settling in, and she found herself questioning whether she deserved the level of attention and recognition she was receiving. She thought about all the other healthcare professionals, social workers, volunteers, and civilians who dedicated their lives to supporting veterans with far less recognition than she was about to receive. Her phone rang around 10 o'clock, and she was surprised to see that the caller was Jessica Thompson, Robert's sister. "I hope I'm not calling too late," Jessica said, "but I wanted to thank you before tomorrow's ceremony. What you did for Robert, and the way you've handled everything since, has meant the world to our family." Jessica went on to explain how the past week had changed her brother's outlook dramatically. The shift in public opinion, the support from veterans organizations, and the broader conversation about civilian support for veterans had helped him begin to heal from the psychological wounds that had been tormenting him since his return from deployment. For the first time since he came home, Jessica said, Robert seems to believe that his service mattered and that he deserves respect for what he went through. Your actions helped make that possible. The conversation with Jessica helped put everything in perspective for Sarah. While the media attention and recognition felt overwhelming, the real impact had been on individual veterans like Robert who needed to know that their service was valued and that they had support from their civilian communities. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, with perfect weather for the outdoor venue that had been chosen to accommodate the larger-than-expected crowd. Sarah arrived early to help with final preparations and to spend some quiet time preparing herself mentally for what was to come. David Chen arrived shortly after her, walking confidently on his prosthetic leg and wearing his dress uniform with obvious pride. He had volunteered to serve as one of the honor guards for the ceremony, a role that felt particularly meaningful given his own journey from injury through recovery to renewed purpose. "Ready for this?" David asked with a smile as they watched the venue filling with attendees. "I think so," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely sure she was. "It still feels surreal that all this started with me just trying to help someone during a difficult moment. But that's exactly why this matters," David said seriously. "You showed what genuine service looks like, seeing a need and responding without thinking about personal cost or recognition. That's an example worth celebrating and encouraging in others." As the ceremony began, Sarah found herself seated in the front row alongside other honorees and distinguished guests. The crowd was larger and more diverse than she had expected, including veterans from multiple generations, active duty personnel, military families, healthcare professionals, and community leaders who supported veteran causes. General Harrison opened the ceremony with remarks about the importance of civilian support for military personnel and the need to recognize those who dedicate their careers to serving veterans. His words were powerful and moving, setting the stage for what was to come. Military service requires not only the courage of those who wear the uniform, General Harrison said, but also the dedication of civilians who understand that supporting our veterans is both a privilege and a responsibility. Today, we recognize individuals who exemplify that dedication. Several other speakers followed, including a veteran who had been helped by civilian volunteers during his recovery, a military spouse who spoke about the importance of community support for military families, and the director of a veterans organization who discussed the role of civilian advocates in improving services for veterans. When Sarah's name was called, she felt a mixture of pride and humility as she made her way to the podium. The 4 generals who had met with her the previous week were all present, standing at attention as she approached. The sight of these distinguished officers showing such respect for her service was overwhelming. General Rodriguez stepped forward to present the recognition, holding a medal that had been specially designed for the new civilian recognition program. The medal featured symbols representing both military service and civilian support, with an inscription that read, "For exceptional service to those who served." Ms. Sara Martinez, General Rodriguez began, his voice carrying clearly across the venue. "Your actions during recent events exemplified the highest traditions of civilian service to our military community. Your compassion, courage, and dedication represent the best of American values and demonstrate the vital role played by civilians in supporting our veterans." As the general continued reading the citation, Sarah thought about her grandfather and the stories that had inspired her to pursue a career serving veterans. She thought about David Chen and his determination to overcome his injuries, about Robert Thompson and his struggle to find peace after combat, and about all the other veterans she had worked with over the years who had taught her the true meaning of courage and sacrifice. Your willingness to stand up for a fellow service member, even in the face of controversy and personal risk, showed the kind of moral courage that we strive to instill in our own personnel, the citation continued. Your ongoing dedication to healing wounded warriors represents the best of civilian support for our military community. As General Rodriguez pinned the medal on her uniform, Sarah felt the weight of not just the physical award, but the responsibility it represented. This recognition wasn't just about her individual actions, it was about acknowledging the important role played by all civilians who dedicate their lives to supporting veterans and military families. But the most significant moment was yet to come. As Sarah prepared to return to her seat, something unexpected happened. All 4 generals stepped forward and, in a gesture that was both unprecedented and deeply moving, rendered formal military salutes to acknowledge her service. The sight of these distinguished officers, men who had commanded thousands of troops and earned the respect of military leaders around the world, saluting a civilian nurse was extraordinary. The crowd fell silent as they witnessed this powerful demonstration of respect and recognition. The salutes lasted for several long moments, during which Sarah felt the full weight of what was happening. These weren't just ceremonial gestures, they were sincere expressions of gratitude and respect from military leaders who understood the value of dedicated civilian service. As the generals lowered their salutes and the crowd erupted in applause, Sarah realized that this moment represented something larger than individual recognition. It was a symbol of the partnership between military personnel and the civilians who support them, an acknowledgement that effective military service requires the dedication of people both in and out of uniform. The ceremony continued with the announcement of the new civilian recognition program and the presentation of awards to several other recipients. Each story shared reinforced the theme that supporting veterans requires a community effort involving people from all walks of life. As the formal portion of the ceremony concluded, Sarah was surrounded by well-wishers, fellow healthcare professionals, veterans, and military families who wanted to express their appreciation for her service and her example. The conversations were moving and humbling, reinforcing her understanding of how much her actions had resonated with people throughout the military community. David Chen approached her as the crowd began to disperse, his face showing both pride and emotion. "I've been thinking about what happened today," David said, and I realized that this is exactly what recovery looks like, not just for individual veterans, but for our entire military community. When civilians like you show that kind of dedication and courage, it reminds all of us that we're part of something bigger than ourselves. Robert Thompson also sought her out before leaving, accompanied by his sister Jessica. The transformation in his demeanor was remarkable. He seemed relaxed and confident in a way that hadn't been evident during the original ceremony. "I wanted you to know," Robert said, "that watching how you handled everything this week helped me understand something important about service. It's not about being perfect or never making mistakes, it's about caring enough to do the right thing when it matters, even when it's difficult." As Sarah drove home that evening, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. What had begun as a simple act of compassion during a difficult moment had evolved into something that would impact how the military recognized civilian contributions for years to come. The medal she wore represented not just her individual actions, but the dedication of countless civilians who worked quietly to support veterans and military families. The salutes from the 4 generals had acknowledged that civilian service was not secondary to military service, but complementary and equally important. More importantly, the events of the past week had reminded her why serving veterans. It wasn't about recognition or awards, it was about the privilege of helping heal the men and women who had sacrificed so much for their country. The ceremony had been meaningful, but the real reward was knowing that she would continue this work for years to come, potentially helping thousands of veterans find their way back to health and wholeness. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah thought about returning to work the next day and continuing the mission that had defined her career. The recognition was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that she was part of something larger than herself, a community of people dedicated to ensuring that those who served their country received the care, respect, and support they deserved. The story that had begun with a single act of compassion had become a testament to the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary differences in the lives of others. And, tomorrow, the work would continue.